I'm here to talk to you about your motivation and your reasonings for wanting a worker socialist co-op, kind of like mandated society at some point in the future. So I guess I can just start with the fairly open-ended question. Why do you want market socialism? Why is that something that you desire and you want us to move towards?
The elimination of the bourgeois as a political class. I think that systems work best when the people who make decisions have the same outcomes as the people who experience the consequences of those decisions. That the closer of an alignment there is, the better and more representative of a system you have. And the issue is that right now we have a remarkable amount of economic inequality, not just along income lines, which is, of course, a serious issue, but also along how people make their money and their relationship to the ways in which people make money. Namely the Marxian divide, bourgeois proletariat. Obviously, it's more complicated than that in the modern era. We're not all like factory workers and factory owners, but I feel like the basic divide, the fundamental underlying schism is still present. And the best way to fix the problems which derive from that is to eliminate the schism entirely by putting everyone on the same side of the fence. We can't all be members of the bourgeois, of course, unless you'd consider collective ownership everyone being bourgeois, which is semantic at that point, but we'd all be workers.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, and then if we take it one step further, then why do you seek the removal of like a societal bourgeois class?
I think that it's much easier to achieve desirable political outcomes when the people who are in power have shared interests with the people who are not in power. I think this is the reason why democracy generally tends to lead to better outcomes for the majority of people, because technically a lot of good political stuff could be done under an absolute monarchy. Medicare for all, even like a parliamentary system possibly for input, proper housing, like good educational standards. All these things can be done. You don't need a democracy for them. You could have any system, but it's easier to get those things when the people who have the power to make it happen are beholden in some way to the people. I don't think we have that economically. I don't even really think we have that politically, because most politicians are in a bit of a stranglehold. The best way to keep the country stable is to make sure that the economy is functioning properly. In a lot of ways, a modern government really is just a girder, a corset for an economy. I mean, it basically just exists to keep things in line, with a couple of extraneous functions sort of to keep the peasantry from revolting. I think we could get much better outcomes if we didn't have that schism.
I'm going to give you 4 arguments that I have right now that are based on our theoretical understanding of the data as it exists right now on worker cooperatives, and how those issues that we can infer based on the literature today could pan out to have really, really negative effects for an economy in the future. The first one, and I would think this is probably the major one, is that right now there is a massive amount of selection bias in the types of people we see working within worker cooperatives today. Because they are so rare, because they are not commonplace, the type of people who are specifically going to seek out a worker cooperative firm to work in are probably going to be people that are vastly more oriented towards more cooperation, towards that type of management and business structure compared to the average person in the population. And we're not sure if the average person in the population would function as well in such a cooperative, business model. And that's one of the issues we have right now with the research. Because there are so few of them, there is a lot of selection bias when it comes to who is actually in those firms right now, and therefore what consequences and how those firms tend to behave and how they tend to do right now in our current economy. Do you agree with this?
I do. Though it should be noted the same could have been said with political democracy back during the 18th century. When we established democracy here in the States, of course, originally it was only landowning white men. It took us a century and a half to arrive at the conclusion that actually democracy works just fine if essentially everyone over 18 can vote. Except, I suppose, felons in some places, but they should be able to vote too. I agree there's an existing selection bias, though I do think that there are ways to culturally compensate for whatever difference there would be between the people who would self-select for worker cooperative participation and people who wouldn't presently.
I will take some issue with the comparison here directly to democracy, because when it comes to the democracy of the general political process, it is a lot more difficult to do measured steps in the meantime compared to like feudalism to democracy. However, when it comes to worker cooperatives, there is a lot of middle ground we can cover before we get to the point where it's like, okay, we need to take this step or we don't take the step. So things like potential mandates in more local communities, in specific sectors, in certain supply lines. There's a lot of steps to take in the meantime and see how they function before we jump all the way to entire worker mandates across, the whole of the economy as a whole. So I understand the general gist of that comparison, but I do think that there's a lot more ground to cover before it gets to that point where it's like, okay, we just have to take the leap and see what happens.
I agree. The difficulty, of course, is that as long as we live in a system where the bourgeois dictate our educational standards, there's not going to be an incentive for educating people to that extent unless those changes are already made. Democracy was kind of a leap of faith in a lot of respects, we went ahead and sort of flew in the face of a tremendous amount of philosophical discourse suggesting that the average peasantry wasn't capable of or intelligent enough to make any decisions. And of course, the aristocracy were the only ones capable of voting back in the day. There are always these difficult leaps and bounds. I am willing to test and to theorize to a point, but democracy is to me non-negotiable. We test until we cannot, and when we cannot anymore, we simply act. And that's a risk I think is worth taking, because I think the consequences of, in this case, fastidiousness could be decades or perhaps centuries more of, interminable bourgeois control.
Just a big clarifying statement. Democracy is non-negotiable. You kind of don't agree with that, right? Not in every instance. Maybe within the workplace and the political situation. It does feel very cool saying it, I'm sure. But we agreed previously, right, that democracy is a non-negotiable in every facet of society. There are a great many facets where, okay, democracy is very, it's very negotiable.
Right.
Here
in a consequentialist sense, of course, everything is negotiable as long as as long as the negotiation could potentially lead to better outcomes. I have a strong ideological bias towards the benefits of democracy. I think most people in the modern world do. They just only apply it to political democracy instead of economic democracy. But it should be noted, of course, the jump to political democracy that we engaged in was not driven by some sort of data-oriented observational understanding that it would lead to better outcomes. It was an ideological leap driven by philosophy and philosophical texts, not by sociologists of the Enlightenment going, well, there's we've done the numbers and this makes it this much more likely to, that's not to say the research is bad, only that, these great political paradigm shifts are often brought about not, there's a degree of faith leaping, I think, in some cases that I think has to be accepted lest we wallow.
I agree with what you mean there, what you say there. So that's the first one then. Excellent. The second one has to do with wage hierarchy. So as I'm sure we all know, in worker cooperatives, the wage pyramid is a lot more compressed compared to a traditional firm. We often see people with, a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, a lot of education more than anything, having higher rates of leaving the firm as compared to regular workers, because that individual person who has a really good education, has a lot of credentials and qualifications, they can obtain more, revenue and more well-being for themselves if they choose to work for a traditional firm. And because of this, some degree of brain drain seems to be a phenomena that will occur in worker cooperatives, especially when there are traditional firms that person could work at instead.
Of course. This is why we have to destroy them. There's always going to be a seepage of resources from equitable democratic institutions to inequitable ones, as long as the inequitable ones are allowed to exist. I suppose the comparison to this would be if you had the United States split evenly, between a place where democracy ruled and a place where you could be a warlord if you wanted, and warlords had the ability to offer ridiculous benefits to people who would come be their, their right-hand men. Something you couldn't possibly give them in a fair democratic society. At the end of the day, predatory institutions will always be able to prey, which is why they need to be eliminated. In terms of how this would function within a worker cooperative society, when there is no such external competition to deal with, as long as we live in a market economy, which market socialism tragically is, the whole competitive wages to bring in talent thing is going to continue to be an issue. I'd be interested in seeing if having some kind of federal mandate of a maximum ratio between like the highest and the lowest paid worker would be possible, if there was like a 1-to-8 like hard gap where the person at top could never make more than 8 times more than the person paid the least, and if there was a way to get around that with contract labor, because then maybe you could have people like sniping the best talent, but in order for them to do that, they'd have to offer wages which would require them to pay their lowest paid people quite a lot, which would be pretty cool.
I understand what you're saying. However, I think there's one issue with the prescription of, okay, that's why you make them illegal and you have like all of the firms are co-ops, therefore people can't go to the other ones. Is that this is
Inshallah.
especially true for highly educated, very educated people, okay, who have a lot of money. They will just move to another country where they can work at a traditional firm and make a lot of money there instead. So unless you have like a big global like, you know, of basically like a global co-op revolution, so to say, where you do co-ops pretty much across the you know, entirety of the economies of the world, it's very likely that somebody might be educated in the United States under where, you know, co-ops are mandated, and then they might move to, I don't know, Europe, let's say, where they may not have all the worker co-ops mandated, and there they will work at a traditional firm, and there they will make a lot more money. So unless something happens globally, there will always be an option, especially for these very, you know, wealthy, well-educated people, to just move and, you know, be able to achieve that elsewhere.
It's a possibility. I don't know how much of a problem capital flight really is, but normally when we talk about capital flight, we're talking about, you know, like very wealthy people who are trying to like make money off the margins. In terms of very talented people, we see the reverse of this because there are doctors in like, you know, India or whatever who will move to the US because of course we can pay them much more there. But I wonder how much that would be accounted for if they could have had a good life in India. Because like it is true, for example, doctors in America make quite a bit more than doctors do in Finland, because we have, you know, a much more predatory private healthcare scheme. But I don't think there's a big thing of like European social democracies having their like top laborers move to the US for better wages. They're fine over there even for lower wages relatively because they like their countries and there are provisions over there that they enjoy and they like being with their family and stuff. So I feel like as long as people here are doing well, they won't be drawn towards, at least not in great numbers, potentially higher paying jobs elsewhere. Or at the very least, if they are, I think there would be just as many people who would be more interested in the thing that we have going on over here than whatever systems they have present there. Especially because there are a lot of very, very technically proficient people who could potentially make high wages who don't, right? There are lots of people who have the skill sets of a high-paid computer engineer or the skill sets of a, you know, like a well-paid doctor or a lawyer or a bunch of other things, but they don't have the pay of those groups. Because when reality, when we talk about the people in those groups who are very well compensated, we're talking about a minority. The average doctor doesn't make $350,000 a year. The average lawyer doesn't make $500,000 a year. So maybe we're skimming off the top here. And maybe we're talking about not just the chance of a group leaving, but the fraction of a chance of a margin of a group leaving. This is one of those I'd need more data to see things, but I feel like it could be managed.
If we talk about countries like Venezuela or of Greece as well, a lot of people who end up getting educated, they will move. And it is a significant economic issue for those countries from, you know, where they move away from. And the question then is, hey, if we were to do a mandate of worker cooperatives, how bad would the brain drain be?
Though I think the United States is closer to Finland than we are to Greece or Venezuela, right? I mean, the reason people fled those countries is because they suffered severe economic catastrophes that led their economy incapable of providing a good life for people of any economic quintile, you know, not just experts. Experts were just the ones who tended to have the money to flee. You know, there were plenty of other types who wanted to flee Greece during their crisis or Venezuela currently. They just didn't have the money to book a plane flight, right? I'm willing to bet that that's more a product of massive global economic disparity than it would be just the potential problems of brain drain altogether. Of course, if America had a functioning social democracy, we would be, I think, a pretty nice country to live in, you know, all things considered. I think people would be willing to stick around for it.
Excellent. All right. So that was number 2. And then I think we can just get through. I was going to have this one at the end, but yeah, I don't think this one will take very long at all. So obviously, we see kind of mixed results when it comes to worker co-ops. So they will perform really, really well and do really good stuff in certain sectors, while in others, they're kind of whatever, and they have very, very kind of like more mixed results, maybe, you know, sometimes even worse results than what traditional firms are. It varies greatly depending on the industry, and therefore maybe like an entire like worker co-op mandate could really adversely affect certain sectors of the economy relative to the other ones. This is, I assume, something we agree on, right?
Of course, we would need to do more research, and if there are industries that are just not amenable to worker control, And of course, there are many types of worker control, right? Obviously, the easiest one would be just a flat cooperative, but anything past, 20 people, and that gets pretty difficult. You can have like different levels of, this block of workers votes in their manager, and then these 10 managers from these 10 regions vote in the head manager, and so on. But, there are many ways things could be handled. But if for some reason we arrived at the conclusion that, internal democratic structures were not efficiently capable of managing the needs of a given industry, then I would look towards other systems.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, excellent. I didn't expect there to be a lot of disagreement on this. And then finally, the fourth kind of like theoretical argument we have, while there are a great many harms and a great many perverse incentives that come with the profit motive, at times there can be potential innovations and potential opportunities for growth by trying, for instance, experimental practices that somebody with the profit with the motive of, hey, I'm going to make as much money as possible as a shareholder. We're going to put a bunch of money into this and risk it, and maybe this will like multiply 10 times in value after the investments were done. Whereas a worker cooperative could be like, hey, we're doing pretty well right now. Everyone within this community of workers that we have, we're chilling. We're happy with how it works right now. We may not want to, we don't have that same drive towards expansion and making a bunch more profit, because we may not want to risk the great quality of life, financial security, job security that we have right now as a collective. So insofar as that's the case, I can see that there being some forms of like downward pressures on the likelihood to engage in some more like experimental business practices or making like very heavy investments into potential innovations in a worker cooperative as compared to a traditional firm.
I suppose my retort to that would be that there is no group more complacent and comfortable than shareholders, sitting on their piles of money. I don't think corporations are particularly inclined towards risk. I don't necessarily know if a worker cooperative would be less inclined towards risk-taking or investment with R&D oriented stuff, but even if they were, I think a lot of this stuff could probably benefit from being handed to the government anyway. Most of the really sick research we get is done through public institutions and grants, from laboratories, built into the basements of universities that get their federal grants, that pull from federal tax budgets. That's how mRNA research came about. Usually corporations, because they're profit motive oriented, are the ones who pick up on that research and then take advantage of existing grant and subsidy programs to extrapolate it into commercially viable products, which is a service I think cooperatives are perfectly capable of doing. If anything, we can improve on that, because I feel like much more needs to be done with the actual technological development side of things, and a little bit less needs to be done with the ways of commercializing existing technological development side of things. Obviously, both can exist in tandem. They're not mutually exclusive, but to summarize, I'm sorry, the issues we have with research are ones which I don't think would be exacerbated with worker cooperatives, and I think could potentially even be improved by a more collectivistic attitude towards the way in which we fund and prioritize our research goals.
I do think that if we have the profit motive still as an incentive that we have kind of like on its own within a company, and assuming we have a good enough social security net, we don't have to get rid of it entirely as a potential source for innovation and for, research and development, which would kind of happen quite a bit. It would be curtailed significantly if we went to a purely cooperative economy, because the government can do a bit, but I think that we should have as many potential incentives for innovation and research and development as we can, and try to minimize the negatives and improve the positives instead of cutting some out entirely.
The only incentive that we have for research and development that exists in an autocratic firm as opposed to a democratic one is the greed of the shareholders, which can be a kick in the ass sometimes, sure, but there are plenty of ways in which that can be a toxic incentive. Greed, for example, can prevent risk-taking. It can also incentivize them to focus only on high-return commercial projects with low risk, rather than projects which have the potential to more substantially impact the research world. Additionally, a system in which the researchers themselves have more control would be one I would be more comfortable with, because from what I've read on R&D, at least in pharmaceutical tech, it seems like pretty often the real brains of the organization, the research technicians, the people who are ungodly smart, they don't have that much control over what they do. They do their research and they're given directions by people with business degrees, but that's a pretty inefficient allocation of resources to have their work being guided by people with absolutely no or at least minimal expertise in their field. I think there are ways in which giving more control to them could itself be a positive incentive, because they might be more capable of determining which research avenues would be preferential. Right now, the only research that's really pursued in any of these private firms are ones which they think can turn a profit later, which means, accepting situations like the COVID vaccine where you have the government stepping in to ensure that it's free, which is a pretty unique exception. For the most part, these innovations are going to come out for the wealthy only. What is the pharmaceutical industry working on right now? Is it cancer, prevention? Is it a cure for cancer? Is it Alzheimer's vaccines? Is it immortality? The answer is all of them, and all of them are going to cost $1 billion when they come out. So that is the consequence of profit, greed-oriented research and development. But I think it's possible that you could procure fewer toxic incentives and more beneficial ones from letting the people who know the research actually work in it. A lot of these people, I think, have pretty altruistic attitudes towards the stuff they do. Nobody gets into pharmaceutical tech because they're dreaming of making a stockholder rich one day, right? I mean, they want to make the medicine. That's, what they care about. Also, even if there was a deficiency in proper incentives, I feel like you could compensate for that in the same way we need to right now with private institutions, which is with proper federal guidance. What do they subsidize? What do they provide grants for? If we needed that incentive for private firms, then, I mean, there's no reason why we wouldn't for cooperatively owned ones.
Okay, yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you said there. So there are absolutely instances in which the profit motive and very, very large shareholders can engage in behaviors that is non-conducive to innovation and further growth. I agree with that. And I also agree that to a great capacity, giving more autonomy to researchers when it comes to determining the research directions, rather than a lot of it being just kind of like where the capital is, can absolutely be very valuable in encouraging more research in areas that may be neglected because of the lack of profit that may be in those industries at the moment under a capitalist economy. I agree with that 100%. But at the same time, there's one question that I have for you. Do you believe that there's any instances in which the profit motive can serve as like a valuable tool towards pushing for innovation, or do you think it's just like pretty much categorically always going to be inferior to other sources?
Well, I think the profit motive is still present in a cooperative firm as long as it's still a market economy, no? Obviously, it's, a sort of collectively determined profit motive as
Profit motive.
opposed to one exclusively for the benefit of the shareholders. But so between those two, I don't believe there's necessarily any incentive which prioritizes the former over the latter. I don't know if there's necessarily a benefit. I can think of some
Wait,
downsides.
just to be clear, I'm not asking you between the two, which one you think is better. I'm asking you whether or not you think that the profit one, if it has value.
Oh, at all. The profit motive is essential with how we have things set up right now. Sure. It'd be nice to get rid of it. Don't get me wrong. This is all phase one, but, insofar as a system which is oriented as I've described it, the profit motive is the necessary underpinning mechanism for a ton of economic functionality. Obviously, the goal would be to replace it with other systems of incentives, but I think it's important to work on the class divide issue, that schism, before you can begin to address any global economic paradigms, because I think that involves way more transformative work. In the meantime, the best we can do is mitigate the profit motive's worst externalities. And
in the meantime, is that meantime right now, or is that meantime like worker cooperative society?
Oh, no, right now, up until
That's
the
right
abolition
now.
of the profit motive, up until the abolition of the commodity form.
Okay.
We have to mitigate its
The
negative
abolition of the
externalities.
commodity form, that's not done under worker cooperatives, to my knowledge, right?
That would have to be next. You would secure
That
the
would have to be
worker cooperatives, and then after that, you would achieve you would have a proletarian state in that situation, and then ideally you could, leverage that global economic power in order to eliminate the commodity form entirely and achieve a classless society. I mean, that's the hope. We're John Maddening it. We've got the game plan. We'll see how it plays out.